I'm apprehensive about today. Um, it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and this is a dangerous time for me to be embarking on anything like this. And I'm nervous about that because this is volume 35, a pretty significant number for this journal, given that I turned 35 over the course of producing it, and that number seems significant to the things that are at stake. I don't remember what I've been talking about, to be honest. I know that this was a journey, and that there's a great many different sources and philosophies and such that I've been running through in establishing an intent and an objective and an outcome for this. But today, more than anything, I just felt like I needed to dump some thoughts. This forum, this media, this channel helps me articulate things more deeply and in a better structured way than just thinking it through my head. And it requires a lot less commitment than writing and revising and refining. Although I do get a bit of that through Facebook to a degree. I don't like to share too much of what's going on deep inside my head on Facebook, but if I can find a good example, then I will post it there. I can hear some folks coming in from a wagon ride outside, so I already might be on a time crunch. Okay, so I needed to do this journal because I've recently been diving back into the Framers Coup, which is a book that I've been working on for a while and took a pretty long hiatus from after the introduction. It's about the writing of the Constitution and the creation of American government shortly after the Articles of Confederation, when we were what many people condescendingly referred to as a simple democracy. Um, I don't know, given the amount of time that I have, which aspect to dig into, but it felt like this was going to be a long one. Um, the first thing that I noticed reading these accounts from this story was that it really seemed like there was a concentrated effort, extra legal in many senses, to reframe the government in a more conservative manner. Um, and a lot of it was Madison, Hamilton, Washington, um, the folks that you probably know. Um, and it was a response to sort of a populist movement resulting from the states individually not communicating in goodwill with one another. Um, some states had strong economic positions related to their geography or their constituency, and they obviously played their hand as best they could, even to the disadvantage of the states nearby. Um, Instead of coming together as a nation and signing some sort of treaty or agreement with an external nation like Spain, Great Britain, or France, each state independently negotiated trade deals or partnerships, and that often worked to the disadvantage of either the colonies as a whole, the states as a whole, or directly in conflict one with another. And when it came to matters of the one distant part of the new United States favoring an outcome that was to the detriment of another other distant part of the United States, it seemed that external foreign nations were taking positions that uh, made it difficult for the United States to stay together as a single unit. Examples of this being, the trade that would favor northern ports for manufacture of ships or other types of textiles or export of fish, versus in the South, the agreement to maintain Spanish control of the Mississippi River, which negatively affected the states that were emerging west and those in the south that needed some way of exporting the mass of farm products that they produced. So every time one state would negotiate for a favorable circumstance in one of those areas, other states would fail. And it became necessary to try to negotiate some of these things at a higher national level. And the first attempt at that was to negotiate free passage on the Mississippi River with Spain, which was something that Southerners greatly favored. But because the person negotiating this represented the entire nation, and the northern states, which were more closely aligned to what was at the time the federal government, didn't approve of this, it was a real headache to try to make that happen, especially because Spain in no way was going to entertain that possibility and threatened the northern states with some trade issues that would have made it much to their detriment to press the issue further. So this landed in the standstill, and the fact that it was originally meant to be negotiation for free passage on the Mississippi, and then at some point, I think his name was John Jay, pivoted and said maybe we're not going to reach that objective, angered a lot of southern states, and they lost trust in their federal government and him as an individual as their advocate. Follow that up with the federal government's inability to collect taxes, and then the individual governments of the states coming up with different ways that they wanted to collect money from their own people to serve different purposes within their states, and how they would favor those projects preferentially over the federal projects. Um, the federal government wasn't happy with the states weren't happy with the federal government, and the people ultimately um, had a pretty decent say over whether or not they were going to pay those things and what for. What happened then was something that I, on in paper, was kind of pleased to see, which is that people within the individual states began rallying to protect their own individual interests against those who were in the minority speculating on things like paper money or new currency, so that the general population of each state would not go bankrupt or lose their property, just so that these speculators could have a return on their investment. So by speculators, I mean individual private persons would invest in the government. The government would issue some sort of currency. The United States was starting to issue some sort of paper currency in each state because there was a severe lack of what was previously being used as currency, which is gold and silver. A lot of that gold and silver was making its way overseas to pay for war debts to Great Britain and to pay external commerce fees and things like that. So a lot of that was being drained out of the new country, and there was nothing that people could use to exchange to maintain their private commerce or pay their private debts. So states issued paper money. The way that the states issued paper money was through the reliance of people who were willing to invest in hopes that there would be some degree of return. That paper money got distributed throughout the states, and then people started using it as legal tender. And in some cases, the states demanded that that be legal tender, and so they made people pay their debts within the states in in that paper money. Problem was paper money was like not very secure at the time, so a lot of people were very upset of the idea that they were going to get paid in paper money. They had to pay out in paper money because it meant that there's a good chance that that paper money could rapidly depreciate and they could lose the value of the labor that got them that money in the first place. So people started to get very upset that their individual value of their contributions to their state, their personal business, their personal industry, their personal products, the output of their labor was not valued at face value because it had to go through this intermediary of paper money, which was being introduced as a way to try to facilitate commerce within each state, and ultimately was issued upon the principal investment of these few people who had significant amount of money to invest in the government. So really, it was a transaction, right? So you have somebody with a lot of money, and they're going to make an investment. A lot of people are going to be begin being in debt to that investment, and then through the mechanism of the state, which is the authority that makes sure that people pay these things, the person who invested all that money makes more money. So really, it's classic banking that you have a lot of money, so you put it out there so that you can get interest, and somebody enforces your ability to collect interest. And in that case, it was the state. And because we were in a democracy, people collected together and said, it doesn't make sense for us to be doing things this way. It's more important that everybody receive the full value of their labor than that whoever was speculating on this paper money made a return on it. So we're just going to say, you can't collect debt in the form of foreclosing on people's properties. um, because of the issuance of paper money, or the rapid devaluation of paper money. So you had almost every state in this position of, investors were not seeing the return. We're not seeing that things go the way that they wanted to with the state with this issuance of paper money, and the depreciation led people to see that their personal assets were in danger, like their farms, and the value of their labor was going down, and the state was still enforcing the people that loaned them the money, right? Like they have to, the debtors were, or the creditors were saying, you have to make sure, you have to collect the interest that you promised us. And of course, the state was beholden to doing that because they didn't want to renege on their deal. So um, the banks kind of had them, or the private interests kind of had them um, in their hands. And there was a rebellion in Massachusetts, Shays Rebellion, where farmers largely didn't want to see farms be confiscated by the government, and so they disrupted local proceedings, state proceedings. They couldn't allow people into the courthouses. People were blocking the ability for the state to foreclose or sell at auction the private farms, that people couldn't pay the now increasing amount of debt through paper money because paper money was depreciating. So at that point, uh, two things happened in response to the rebellion. They decided to go through the legal means, and a lot of people who were part of this populist, more quote unquote communist or socialist movement were taking seats in Massachusetts away from the quote unquote coastal elites, the people who maintained business interests on the West Coast or on the East Coast, involved with trade and industry. And that popular movement was a great concern for a particular class of people. And that particular class of people began sending letters to one another back and forth saying, we're moving in a dangerous direction wherein the general population can cancel debts, reallocate resources, reallocate property. And that implied that property was not secure. And I can understand and respect that the guarantee of private property is actually an incredibly important thing if you're going to try to build commerce or industry within your nation. If at any time your product, your property can be taken away, and by whom it's taken away, the different ways that that works, it's going to not encourage anybody to be productive. What you want is an industry where everybody has the ability to compete, and you don't have one monopoly coming through and squashing competition and making sure that everything goes through their traditional process. You want creative destruction, and you want people to be able to retain their own property and intellectual property and means of production and so on and so forth. But if that's under threat, then it discourages innovation, and people are not inclined to start new businesses or move into even established um, sects of the market. So um, it is bad. In a weird way, you have to guarantee people that their property is secure and can't be taken away either by another large private entity or by a large public entity. But at the same time, I also believe that you have to maintain a standard of living universal to everyone, that they're not going to lose um, whatever it is that you've guaranteed as the minimum baseline for people. And there has to be some degree, some maximum, wherein once you've surpassed some threshold, it becomes more and more difficult to take larger shares of the pie. Because if once somebody passes a particular threshold in private industry, they become competent at forming government in their interests. So it's a challenge, right? Because you don't want government to be absolute over all business, but you don't want any business to be absolute over government. So the ways in which you make sure that as these forces rise, that they always have some way of defeating one another is important. So at this point in time, we were threatened by the idea that maybe a populist movement was going to reallocate property using the state as a mechanism, as a supreme mechanism over all private property. And now I think at this point in the United States history, we're at a place where you have very few oligopoly or large companies, large monopolies that sort of dictate the way in which the state allocates property. So um, different circumstances, different times. But the people who felt most threatened by this were folks that we at that time referred to as um, founding fathers. So I have some company. Do you want to come over here and help me do my journal, Lainey? No? Yes? Maybe? 15 minutes in, gonna see whether or not anybody's gonna join me or if I have to stop. Sounds like I have to stop. All right, I will do this later. The end.